The Lama Tsongkhapa Institute the Lama Tsongkhapa Institute expresses a heartfelt thanks to Venerable Tenzin Gache for accepting our invitation to be our speaker today. This presentation is part of our free Master Program Talk series, which aims to explore Buddhist teachings in depth while providing glimpses into the FPMT Masters Program curriculum. Venerable Tenzin Gache grew up in Boston, USA, and graduated from Tufts University in 2005. A year later, he was ordained in Dharamsala by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and has been studying at Saraji Monastery in southern India ever since. He is currently entering the 17th year of the standard 19-year Geshe study program. His translation of his teacher, Kyabje Chodron Rinpoche's book, Mastering Meditation, Instructions on Calm Abiding and Mahamudra, was published in 2020, and he recently completed the translation of Rinpoche's teachings on the Guru Yoga of the 6 sessions and the Bodhisattva and Tantric vows. He has translated several important teachings by his teacher, Kyabje Chodron Rinpoche, including works on Calm Abiding and Mahamudra, Guru Yoga, and Bodhisattva and Tantric vows. After the presentation, if time allows, we give priority to the Master Program students for a Q&A, and then we open it up to the room. Thank you once again from Gache.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I should rename myself. Hold on. You see, I'm using my student's computer here. Okay, now you know who I am. So, hello to everybody. It's nice to see you all. Can't see most of you, but I trust that you're there. English. Okay, so yes, we're having a talk today. It's the second talk on Madhyamaka. We had the first one back in February, I believe, and that was on the object of negation. So today we're talking about the subject reverse consequence and commonly appearing subjects, which I warned, you could say last time at the end of the talk, that this is the most difficult subject in Madhyamaka. Nevertheless, I feel that after the last talk, which was on the object of negation, I had the sense that it was a bit too much for some people, that I tried to put too many debate points into it such that it became too much in a short period of time. So today I've tried to make it a little bit more straight to the point. You'll see there's the same number of slides today as last time, but there's less material per slide, which also I think is going to be easier. So we'll try our best to try to comprehend this subject. It's not going to be easy, and it's not something we can really comprehend in 2 hours, I don't think, but I want to give an introduction to how this is important. I personally felt through Madhyamaka that this was what seemed like the most clear, I know clear isn't quite the word, but most direct talk about what it really means. What is the distinction about the Prasangika system? And then in terms of an understanding of emptiness, I think if someone understands the meaning of what it means that an object, a valid cognizer that establishes something, can still be mistaken to that thing to which it establishes, what Chandakirti means by that, then it's really getting to the point of what he means by emptiness. And actually, I was just in a conversation this week with my classmate. I mentioned I was going to be giving a talk on this subject, and he told me that he had heard a talk recently by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I don't think it was a recent talk, but he had been listening to it recently, in which His Holiness had been saying a similar thing, that he said, if you understand this subject, especially the second one, the commonly appearing subjects, then you really can understand the Madhyamaka view of emptiness. So why don't we just focus on the second subject? The main reason is we can see it's a digression from the first. It's this debate between Chandakirti and Baba Viveka. And so Chandakirti, as was mentioned in the introduction that I wrote to this talk, he's setting out to defend Buddhapalita. So some of you might know that, of course, Nagarjuna in the 2nd century, perhaps, we don't know exactly when, he wrote his text, Root Wisdom, Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And then that was expounded or commented upon by his predecessors, by the lineage after him, his successors. So the first major commentary we have is called Kale Jigme, and nobody knows who wrote it. Previous Tibetans, the Kale Jigme is the Tibetan name, I should say. I don't remember the Sanskrit name. I can't. It's something. Abya is Jigme. That text, the earlier Tibetans thought it was an auto-commentary, but that was a mistake. Tsongkhapa gives some very clear reasons why it's not an auto-commentary. One of the main reasons is that it quotes Arya Deva. It would be very unusual for a teacher to quote his own student as an authority. So it seems very unlikely that Nagarjuna wrote it. The other main reason is that Buddhapalita and Chandakirti never mention it. If it was an auto-commentary, they would probably make mention of it. So then there was later commentaries by Deva Sharma. Deva Sharma is another one I don't believe we have in Tibetan. But that was then the basis, it said, for Bhava Viveka's commentary. And then there was this commentary by Buddhapalita just before Bhava Viveka. So in Bhava Viveka's commentary, shut up, Dronme, so that, what is it? Prajna Pradipa, I believe, the lamp of wisdom. This was, he begins the text in the first chapter by attacking Buddhapalita, who was still there at the time in Nalanda, and saying that his text was not especially his commentary on this first stanza of Nagarjuna's text was not adequate for generating a valid cognizer in the mind of the opponent. Now, this first stanza, which is not, we'll see it in a minute, it's negating the four extremes of birth from self, from other, from no cause, or from both self and other. There's four parts. There's negating those four, and it's in the context of negating a production from self, which is a fairly straightforward concept. It's not that difficult to negate production from self. It's a philosophical view, it said, that is held by the Samkhya school and maybe other philosophical schools, but it's not a normal way to think. Most people do not think that things are born from themselves. It's a little counterintuitive. Nevertheless, what Viveka attacks Buddhapalita on is this commentary on that particular point, saying that his commentary, his way of positing a consequence, he does not posit a syllogism, his way of positing a consequence to show how you would negate self-production is not, it's not suitable, or it's not adequate to change the mind of the Samkhya. So I was just joking with a student this week. It's sort of like, it's like in a war, and then the two sides are allies, but then they turn on each other. So they're not actually debating the Samkhya anymore. Now they're fighting each other about how do you best debate with the Samkhya. But in any case, so Bhaviveka, he was very influential, and Buddhapalita was, it seems, not taken so seriously in his lifetime. There's the story anyway that I was told by my teacher here is that Bhaviveka was, I can't remember if he said a Brahmin caste or a royal caste, but in either case he was somebody who, even though as monastics there's not supposed to be any caste distinction, there apparently was still some people who took it more seriously because he came from a very high class background. So later, about, I don't know, maybe 100 years later or less, Chandakirti, who became abbot of Nalanda, he wrote his own commentary on the root wisdom, which is called the Clear Words, Prasanapada. And so if you're studying, I believe in the master's program, you're studying illuminating the intent, that's different. That's Chandakirti's text, Entering the Middle Way, which is it said that an independent commentary, in as much as it does not comment word by word on the root text. Whereas Prasanapada, the root Clear Words does do so. It's a word by word commentary. And so on the commentary on that first stanza, his commentary in Tibetan anyway is about 70 pages just on that one stanza. And that's when he really establishes view in contrary to Bhavaviveka, and supporting Buddhapalita and saying that he actually had the right way to debate. But then he turns it around and says that because Bhavaviveka insists on arguing a certain way, it shows that he doesn't understand emptiness, which is not what Bhavaviveka was saying about Buddhapalita. Bhavaviveka never, in his commentary, said anything about Buddhapalita having a wrong understanding of emptiness. And actually, Bhavaviveka's main commentator, the commentator on Bhavaviveka, which is named Avalokita Vrata, who was quite a bit later, he says that they were the great masters of the past who brought down the middle way views, such as Buddhapalita and Bhavaviveka. He doesn't mention Chandrakirti, but it seems that there was a sense that he just had a mistake about how to argue, but he understood the basic point of emptiness, whereas Chandrakirti says that actually Bhavaviveka does not understand emptiness. It shows that he has a view of self-existence because of the way that he argues and uses language. So my point in saying that you study illuminating the intent there is that you wouldn't have covered this topic. So this might be new to a lot of you. So it's really just an introduction to this. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I think definitely the best in English, best thing you can read on this is Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Meditation on Emptiness. He has a very large section on this debate. The other option would be to read Tsongkhapa's own texts. You can read Essence of Eloquence, which is translated by Robert Thurman. Hopkins' translation of the Madhyamaka section is not, or he didn't make a translation of it. So Thurman's translation, which, yeah, I haven't read that, so I'm not sure. Even if it was a good translation, it might not be easy to understand exactly what Tsongkhapa is saying because you don't know the context. Or there's the section of the Lamrim Chenmo, so the Great Stages of the Path, on special insight. And actually, I would suggest if someone wants to read that is to read Geshe Zopa's commentary on that. It's a lot more clear. Again, it was spoken to Westerners, and so it explains more of the context. Whereas again, if you just read Tsongkhapa's words, which in Tibetan are very profound, and once we have the context, we see how profound it is, especially Essence of Eloquence. It's incredible, his exposition there of it. But if you don't know the context, it's like, for example, in the monastery, you memorize that part before we debate it, and then you have no idea what it's talking about until you actually get into the debate. So I just want to give you an introduction to what are the topics, what is actually going on, and then if you want to read more deeply about it later, you can do so. So I'll start by doing the screen share here. I'll need to be allowed to share the screen, I believe, to do that. Or maybe you can make me the co-host. If there's an issue, just let me know if you understood that. But anyway, I'll continue talking while we're waiting. Yeah. Is it working? Is it going to be possible to do that? If not, I think you can do it. Yeah.
Yeah. 1 minute. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Take your time. So, I'll just begin by talking about the first stanza, which will be one of the first slides. The first stanza of the text by Nagarjuna. So not from itself, nor other, nor from both, and still not causelessly. No thing has ever been produced in any way at any time. So that is how Bhavaviveka reads it. Actually, Chandrakirti reads it slightly differently, and there's a subtle difference. And see if you can hear it. It's only in the third line. So it says, not from itself, nor other, nor from both, and yet not causelessly. In such a way, what's it? No thing has ever, I can't remember exactly how I wrote it, but it's no thing has ever been produced in those ways, yet any way at any time. So the difference is that Bhavaviveka takes the stanza as saying, nothing has ever been produced because it's not produced in one of four ways. Whereas Chandrakirti reads it as just saying nothing has ever been produced in one of four ways. He says it does not actually explicitly say nothing has ever been produced. Because the point is, from his understanding, if you understand that it's not produced in any of those four ways, you will easily understand that it's not produced at all. But Bhavaviveka wants to draw it out much more clearly. So we see already there's this beginning of Bhavaviveka wanting to make everything very explicit. Right, we'll see as we see Buddhapalita's commentary that it's understandable perhaps why Bhavaviveka thought it wasn't adequate, because it's very almost esoteric, his consequence that he gives. At first, it doesn't seem to be a direct consequence. Okay, good. So I think, well, yeah, now I can share this. Okay, so I think you can all see that. Ooh. Okay, so here we have reverse consequence, a commonly appearing subject. So you see, the idea is people are on the same page here. That's the idea, that a commonly appearing subject means that people are in agreement, at least about what they're arguing about. So we'll see that in Chandrakirti's philosophy, that's not a necessary condition for having a valid argument. So then we have Chandrakirti, in his clear words, makes the response that Buddhapalita never got to make, as I mentioned before, that Buddhapalita never responded, but then Chandrakirti responds for him to Bhavaviveka. So he says, the meaning you get when you reverse the consequence is relevant for the opponent. It has no relevance to me because I do not hold the thesis. Therefore, I have not contradicted Nagarjuna's tenets. So we have this section first here, reverse the consequence. So there's two ways to understand that. In Tibetan, it's not actually in the Sanskrit text. It says the title of the section being reverse consequence, but in Tibetan, it's how we usually refer to this section of the text. We call it teldok, which means reverse consequence. And it's understood it could mean one of two things. It's one that Buddhapalita is saying that when you reverse my consequence, we'll understand what that means in a minute, then I don't have to accept the opposite of it. Usually the consequence, it implies that you're saying the opposite is true. So it follows that sound is permanent because it's not produced. It implies that you think, well, it is impermanent. It's not, it's impermanent because it's produced. Or it's actually, you could also have it, the real opposite would be the subject sound, it is impermanent because it's produced. So that if you usually with a correct consequence, or what we call a consequence that implies an autonomous syllogism, the opposite should be true. So that's like a perfect consequence, that it shows you that your view is exactly the opposite of the truth, and you just reverse that, you get the right view. You think sound is permanent, but now you see that there's a consequence of that. So I said it wrong the first time. It follows that sound is not a product because it's permanent. So now you realize it can't be a product. But Buddhapalita gives a consequence that he does not accept the opposite of it. And he's saying that it does not have to be that way because he says that I don't hold a thesis. Now, there's many ways to understand that, and that's similar to a saying that Nagarjuna makes in his text, Dispeller of Disputes. But it's understood that he does not accept either of the four kinds of production. He does not accept production from self, other, both, or neither, which Bhavaviveka doesn't get that point. Bhavaviveka assumes that if something is produced, it has to be from one of those four, in which case he takes it to mean if it's not produced from other, it's not ultimately produced from other. But of course, conventionally, it's produced from other. If it's not produced from any of those four, then it can't be produced. So right here, this is where Chandrakirti feels he does not understand the meaning of emptiness. So we'll talk about that a little bit, although that is a bit of a side point about why it can't be produced from other. And then so he says, I have not contradicted Nagarjuna's tenets, which is exactly what Buddhapalita says. Sorry, Bhavaviveka says about him. He says, you contradicted Nagarjuna's tenets with your statement, and we'll see what that means. So why is this debate relevant? Right? We might have a question. We're just talking about something that was happened in the 5th or 6th century. How is it relevant to us today? So we'll see. Buddhapalita, Bhavaviveka, and Chandrakirti use very complex philosophical language that is only accessible to experts. As I said, if you just read this debate, let alone reading Essence of Eloquence by Tsongkhapa, if you just read the texts by Chandrakirti and Bhavaviveka, it's almost impossible even to figure out what the sentence is, which is what subject of the sentence and what is the verb. And in Tibetan anyway, it's very hard. It might be easier in Sanskrit. I don't know. But in English, even looking at it, it's pretty hard to see what's going on. So then we see Tibetan, because it's hard, it's not just that if Tibetan authors understood it, we see that Tibetan authors have interpreted this debate in a variety of ways, and some do not even consider it to evince a strong difference of opinion on emptiness. Again, I was just talking about this with my classmate last night. I didn't even mention I was giving this talk, but he brought it up, and he was saying that before Tsongkhapa, really, nobody really even understood there was a big difference between the Prasangika and the Svadhantrika, and most Tibetans followed the Svadhantrika for quite a while. And then after Tsongkhapa, then Gorampa, who was the main critic of Tsongkhapa, is a Sakya scholar, he also said that Tsongkhapa is wrong, that Bhavaviveka does not have a difference in the view of emptiness. But Tsongkhapa felt this was a very important point. So I don't mean to say that Tsongkhapa's the Gelug view is necessarily right, the other ones are necessarily wrong. It's up to us to look at that. But if we want to understand anyway Tsongkhapa's thought on this, his feeling is that this particular debate, as well as some other points in other sections of Bhavaviveka's text and Chandrakirti's text, show a strong difference of opinion on emptiness. And actually, one of the criticisms people made was, if there was such a strong difference, why didn't Chandrakirti bring that out and make a point of it? And Tsongkhapa says, well, he did. That's what this debate is about. And you just didn't get that point when you read the debate. So then Tsongkhapa sees Chandrakirti as recognizing a subtle grasping at inherent existence within Bhavaviveka's words, despite the latter's explicitly stating negations of true existence. So then here is, why is this useful? They say, if we train in the philosophy of emptiness and employ strong mindfulness in social interactions, we may also notice how our and others' speech reveals our grasping at inherent existence. That's really the important thing here. We can train in this. We can see the way that people talk. They might say they're talking about emptiness, but if we actually listen to the way they talk about it, the way they listen to the way that we talk about it, we might start to notice that there's a sense that emptiness is a real thing, a real truly existent thing, or that conventional existence has more reality than it actually does. So here we have, I mentioned this before, while we were waiting, we have Bhavaviveka versus Chandrakirti's reading of stanza 1. So not from itself, nor other, nor from both, not without a cause. No thing has ever been produced in any way at any time. And then not from itself, so Chandrakirti says, not from itself, no other, nor from both, and not without a cause, has anything thus been produced, meaning in any of those 4 ways, in any way, at any time. So he says it's not actually explicitly stated, nothing has been produced. So this is how Buddhapalita comments on this stanza. So he has the short summary and then the extensive explanation. They're consecutive in his text. So the short summary is, all things are not produced from self, because their production would become pointless, and because there would be extreme consequences. So that might not even look like a consequence right there. But actually, if we see what does it mean, it says, it follows that all things their production is pointless, and there are extreme consequences because they're produced from self. We can draw that out of what he's saying. Now, the extensive explanation is not much more extensive, and I asked one of my teachers about that. How is this extensive? It's almost the same number of words, but the difference is that there's more meaning in it. So we'll see, all things that exist in their own nature. So that's whereas just saying all things, it is pointless for them to be produced again, because if they existed yet were produced again, they would never stop being produced. So those are the extreme consequences that he just references before. And so here he gives a sign, a reason, which is that all things are established in their own nature. So it looks like that's part of the subject, but actually when we break it down in a minute into like a consequence that we can read as a consequence, we can see it as the subject, all things. It is pointless for them to be produced again because they already exist in their own nature. And then we follow that with, if there's no pervasion, then we would say, well, it existed that they would never stop being produced because there's some reason for them to be produced again, despite already being established. So it's not clear right away what is the consequence that he's stating. So we note that Bhavaviveka does not recognize that the extensive explanation is clarifying the short summary. So his debate only relates to the short summary. So he doesn't even seem to be paying much attention to this second point. He's mainly debating the first short summary and saying this is inadequate. It's not enough information. And also, it's understood that when he says all things, he's thereby giving an example. So he says one thing, for example, another thing. So he could fill in anything. He could say a subject, a sprout. It has this consequence, such, for example, the way that a pot would have that consequence. Okay, so then we have 3 ways to read Buddhapalita's consequence. So the first one is called the explicit reading. Now, this is not something that I've seen in any text. This is something that we talk about in debate. It's kind of a common understanding within the oral tradition at Sarah that there are 3 ways to read it. And then we write these out, or at least speak them out in debate. But I haven't seen it in a book. But the understanding is there's the explicit reading, which is what it literally says, the words. Then there's the intended meaning, what actually Buddhapalita was intending to say, if you understood him correctly. And then there's Bhavaviveka's misreading of it. So we have the explicit reading is the subject, all things. They are not produced from self, because it would follow that their production is pointless and that their production would never end. So it is a consequence, as we see, it would follow, but it's not phrased that way. Usually a consequence would come first rather than the reason. But the reason comes first, and then the consequence comes second. So it can be a little hard to follow that. But anyway, if things were produced from self, we see their production would be pointless. Why produce? If it's already produced, why does it need to produce itself? And it would never end. If it can produce itself, it can produce itself a second, a third, a fourth time. So there's these 2 extreme consequences of production from self. So now here's the intended consequence, which it's a bit more on the slide, but it's the same basic wording, just spread out a bit more, with some clarifications as well. So we see, first of all, the subject, a sprout, and this is very important, this parenthesis. We'll understand this later when we come to commonly appearing subjects. So it says a sprout, parentheses, that Samkhyas posit as existing in a non-manifest way at the time of the cause. That's not the subject. The subject is not a sprout that exists in a non-manifest way at the time of the cause, because if that was the subject, it would be wrong. There's no such thing. However, Samkhya understands the subject that way. So they have a different understanding of what a sprout is than what a Madhyamaka understands. But anyway, so that the sprout that they understand in this way, it's not saying that it's a sprout that is that way. So, okay, so the subject of sprout, it follows that there is no point in its being produced again. That's the consequence. And the reason, because it is already established in its own nature. So it's already exists. If we could shorten it by just saying because it exists, that's sometimes just for abbreviation said that way. And then we have, for example, a sprout that has already become manifest. That could be an example. It would be a very good example for the Samkhya, because you could say to them, well, why would a sprout that's non-manifest need to produce itself, but a sprout that is already manifest, there's no point in it producing itself again? Well, it should be similar. Why should anything need to produce itself again? So if you say no pervasion, just because something isn't established, then it there's not necessarily no point in it being produced again, then we say the subject a sprout. It follows that its production is endless because it exists, yet is produced again. So if it's produced a second time, why not a third and a fourth time? Now, this is the consequence. There's a question because we call this the consequence school. And some people say the reason is that they believe that you do not need a syllogism in order to generate inferential valid cognition. That's not entirely clear. And anyway, the way that Jetsun Shuki Gyaltsen interprets this, which is how we follow at Serra J, is that you don't need to explicitly state a syllogism, but the person implicitly understands it. It's called other renowned syllogism. It fits their tenets. So this, we'll see, usually, as I mentioned, the reverse of a consequence would switch the sign and the predicate. So if we say the subject sound, it follows that it is not produced because it is permanent. Then the reason would be the subject sound, it is impermanent because it is produced. So it switches the two. Whereas here, it does not do that. So that's also what Bhava-viveka did not see, according to Chantakirti. So the thing that is the predicate stays as the predicate, except that it becomes the opposite of it, right? It becomes no point as opposed, sorry. Actually, no, sorry. It stays exactly as it is, as you see. It stays as the same thing, but a reason, or say a syllogism rather than a consequence. So the subject of sprout, there is no point in its being produced again because it is already established in its own nature. You do not need to switch the predicate and the sign here. So it's called other renowned syllogism, which is the opposite of an autonomous syllogism. And we'll discuss that later. What does it mean to be an autonomous syllogism? But it's understood, by at least by Jetsun Shuki Gyaltsen, that this is implied here. The person, when they hear the consequence, they'll understand the syllogism. So here we have thirdly, Bhava-viveka's interpretation, or I could say, as I said before, misreading of Buddhapalita's consequence, which is that the subject, a sprout, it follows that it is pointless and that its production is pointless and endless because it is produced from itself. So he's going to attack this, which is not what Buddhapalita meant. So he attacks the reading that he understands it as implying. So he points out three faults in Buddhapalita's consequence. One, Buddhapalita does not state a sign or an example that is capable of negating production from self. And as I said before, the sign and the example are both there in the extensive explanation. But he's not paying attention to that. He just sees him as saying, it follows that it's not produced from, that it's pointless because it's produced from self. Now, that could be considered a reason. He says it's pointless. So therefore, it's not produced from self because there's a point in it being produced. But Bhava-viveka does not consider that a valid reason. So he stated some kind of reason, but it's not a valid reason. So there's no way the person is going to change their mind. And we'll explain these each individually afterwards. And then we have number two, Buddhapalita does not anticipate and dispel a potential Samkhya response. So Bhava-viveka is saying that he goes on to say there could be this particular way that they could argue back to you. And you never actually anticipated that or said anything about that, about what would you say if they said this. Now, we debated about this point. We said, well, it's the same fault applies to Bhava-viveka if you read his consequence. But actually, if you read his text, the Lamp of Wisdom, he does do that below. He then anticipates this response and said, this is what I would say if somebody said this kind of thing. Whereas Buddhapalita doesn't do that. And then finally, Buddhapalita leaves himself open to attack, which is meaning he could be attacked by another Madhyamaka for contradicting the Madhyamaka tenets. We'll discuss that. And that's what we saw in Chantakirti's response. He said, no, I did not contradict the tenets. But Bhava-viveka thinks that he did. So the first one, Buddhapalita does not state a sign or example that is capable of negating production from self. So again, remember this from before, according to the Bhavaviveka, the implied syllogism of Buddhapalita's consequence, we'll see, is just going to be the switching the predicate and the sign. So that rather than saying it follows that its production is pointless because it is produced from self, now we just switch that, we get the opposite. The subject, a sprout, it is not produced from itself because its production is purposeful and has an end limit. So therefore, those consequences, because they would apply to production from self, therefore it can't be produced from self. But he says, and now this point about why is that not a correct sign, that's rather difficult. There is a debate about that point. So what I'm going to present here is the position again of Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen. As I mentioned before, it's good to know that on these points, I'm mainly trying to follow the Sarah J position. So there's certain subtle points of this debate that are not, they're not agreed upon even by all the Giluk scholars. But the reason that Jetsun Chökyi Gyaltsen says this is not a correct consequence is because, or a correct sign, if an opponent already realizes that a sprout is produced, they understand that it is produced from causes and therefore not from itself. Right? Because to be a correct opponent here, then they have to understand the sign, which is that it's production. So they have to know that sprout has production. And the meaning of production is production from a cause. That's the definition of production. Something that is produced from a cause, or born. Kepa in Tibetan. So really born from a cause. So if they already understand that, then there's no need to prove for them that it is not produced from itself. So he's saying that the Samkhya don't really understand the meaning of production. And so they couldn't possibly have this be a correct sign for them. They wouldn't have had a valid cognizer understanding the production of a sprout. So next is, Buddhapalita does not anticipate and dispel a potential Samkhya response. So what is that? It says the Samkhya opponent might respond. When you say a sprout is not produced from itself, what do you mean by sprout? Right? So that's we saw in the consequence, say the intended consequence of Buddhapalita. He just meant a sprout. He didn't mean any particular kind, but it's understood by the Samkhya in a particular way. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for the debate itself. But Bhavaviveka thinks that it does. He thinks that the Samkhya could argue, well, we have to first establish what is a sprout. Then we can have an argument about it. So when you say a sprout is not produced from itself, what do you mean? Do we mean it is not produced from a resultant manifest sprout? So again, I mentioned it briefly before, but to understand the Samkhya philosophy, they believe that at the time of the cause, things exist in an unmanifest way. So in the seed is an unmanifest sprout that then becomes manifest at the time of the result of the sprout. So when you say a sprout is not produced from itself, do you mean a resultant sprout, a manifest sprout, is not produced from a manifest sprout? Or do you mean it is not produced from a causal, unmanifest sprout, the one that exists at the time of the seed? So in the first case, they would say, I accept. We agree. A resultant sprout is not produced from a resultant sprout. And there's no point in it being produced again. But in the second case, we would reply the provision is opposite. It's saying there is no point in it being produced because it already exists in its own nature, or we would say, well, there is a point in it being produced. If something, if something if something is produced from something which is its causal unmanifest sprout, there is a point in its being produced, because it hasn't been manifest yet. So the pervasion is not that it is no point, there is a point if something has not been manifest yet. So Bhavaviveka has a way of responding to this possible debate, but Buddhapalita fails to anticipate it and dispel it. So he hasn't convinced the Samkhya. They would just say, well, we agree with you. We agree that a resultant sprout doesn't come from a resultant sprout, but we don't agree that it doesn't come from an unmanifest sprout, and you haven't proved to us that it doesn't. And then thirdly, we have Buddhapalita leaves himself open to attack. So what is that? He says a consequence implying an autonomous syllogism, I mentioned this before, is one in which switching the opposite of the reason for the probandum, or the predicate. So actually, literally, I don't know if you've trained in this or know this language, but it's predicate of the probandum, right? The probandum is, so if we have sound, the subject sound, it is impermanent because it's a product. The probandum is sound is impermanent. The predicate of the probandum is impermanent. So if we switch switching the opposite of the reason for the probandum, so we make the thing that is the reason and take the opposite of that. So the opposite of permanence is an impermanence, and make that the thing to be proved. Probandum means thing to be proved, right? And then we take the opposite of the consequence, which is not a product, and make that as the reason. That should be a correct syllogism. That's what means a consequence implying an autonomous syllogism. You reverse the two, the predicate and the sign, and you get a correct sign, a correct syllogism. So the example here, the subject is sound. It follows it is not a product because it is permanent. So the implied syllogism would be the opposite. The subject sound is impermanent because it is a product. So first we have to understand that, and then we see why is he open to attack. So Bhavaviveka assumes that Buddhapalita intended to state a consequence implying an autonomous syllogism. Right? So Buddhapalita did not intend that, as we talked about before. He did not mean that you should switch the sign and the predicate. He did not even believe in such a thing as an autonomous syllogism, according to Chantakirti. But Bhavaviveka takes it as axiomatic. If he's arguing, he's trying to imply an autonomous syllogism. And the reason he thinks that he intends to do it also is because in his introductory statement that we didn't look at before, where Buddhapalita says, how do we establish production in a conventional manner? So he states that he will establish conventional production. So Bhavaviveka assumes that he is trying to establish some form of production. And thereby he's not trying to just negate the opponent's view, wrong view, but he's trying to establish the right view. So he must be trying to establish some kind of syllogism. And thereby Bhavaviveka, it presumes that this means that Buddhapalita intends to imply a consequence that proves an affirming negation. That's the problem. Because he's trying to negate production from self, but then prove production from other. Because that is how things are produced in Bhavaviveka's view. And that is the conventional way that things are produced, and that's what he's trying to show. So in the process of negating production from self, he will affirm or prove production from other, which exists conventionally in Bhavaviveka's opinion. Right? That things are produced from from other, in a conventional manner, in a conventional sense. So the implied syllogism of Buddhapalita's consequence, as Bhavaviveka understands it, would be the subject, a sprout, it is not produced from itself, because its production is purposeful and has an end limit. We said this before, right? But this syllogism implies that, one, a sprout is produced, because the signs state that explicitly. Right? We'll just look back at it again. Because its production is purposeful. So in stating it, it's implied that the thing is produced. And more importantly, Buddhapalita intends to state that, according to Bhavaviveka. Remember, he wants to prove that how things are conventionally established. And furthermore, it states it is not produced from itself. Right? The predicate says not produced from itself. The sign says produced. So we have the statement, some of you might remember, if you've studied at all about how do we say, Shensel, or how do we say it in English, the negative phenomena. you have when something implies something, but in the context of negating, it implies something else. We have the statement, the fat Devadatta does not eat in the daytime. It implies that he eats at night. It doesn't state it explicitly, but if we say somebody is overweight, then it implies they're eating something, and we say they don't eat in the daytime, it implies they must eat at nighttime. So likewise, if we say things are produced but not from self, we're implying they're produced from other, because that's the only other possibility. So too does the statement, a sprout is produced but not from itself, imply that a sprout is produced from something other than itself. So the problem, according to Bhava-viveka, is that by proving emptiness with a sign that implies something else, Buddhapalita contradicts the Madhyamaka tenets, thereby leaving himself open to attack, that he's not a Madhyamaka. Not because he misunderstands emptiness, but just because he argues in the wrong way. So, for example, Nagarjuna states in his Examining the World, now this is a text that I don't believe we have in Tibetan, but it is quoted in Tsongkhapa's Essence of Eloquence in a different section of the text than this section on the commonly appearing subjects. But it's generally, we talked about this in debate, what tenet or what passage of Nagarjuna is he contradicting? It seems like maybe this one. So I said it's not in Tibetan, Tsongkhapa quotes it, but he quotes it as being quoted somewhere else. Right? It's quoted in one of the commentaries on Nagarjuna, but the text itself doesn't seem to be in Tibetan. But anyway, the text reads, negating that this thing exists is not to hold that it does not. For if you say a thing's not black, you haven't said that it is white. Right? So if we say it doesn't exist, or really how we understand this, it doesn't exist inherently, does not mean that it is inherently non-existent either. It's like saying, if you say something is not black, it doesn't say that it's white. That statement does not imply that. It's a non-affirming negation, as opposed, or a non-implicative negation, as opposed to an affirming negation. It doesn't imply something else. So by making a statement that is affirming something else, Buddhapalita is contradicting Nagarjuna's tenets of how you should argue about emptiness. So now here is the response made by Chandrakirti to say that Buddhapalita was not mistaken. So remember, the first criticism was that it does not state a sign that is capable of generating valid cognition. So he says, first of all, a consequence does not need to imply an autonomous syllogism to generate a correct inference in an opponent's mind. Right, so this is where we have the meaning of the word prasangika, the consequence Is this just starting now?
Venerable Gache's computer has crashed. So, but he's coming back online.
Hopefully soon. Yeah, why don't let's see how quickly this goes. We only have to wait a minute. Yeah, it's already.
che è cresciato.
Okay. Here I am again. I hope you can hear me. Still named after Tenzin Dondrup again, but I'll just leave that this time. So let's try to share the screen again. Okay. So so where we were. Yeah, this is where we were. Yeah, and I'm just trying to do the it's not allowing me to. I can't see. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here we are. Sorry about that. I hope you had some time to reflect on these difficult points. So the point is, he did not state a sign. Yeah, okay, so the point I was saying is that you don't need to have a sign stated explicitly. You just state the consequence, and that can generate a correct, valid cognition in the opponent. And indeed, there is no such thing as an autonomous syllogism. So that's a different point. We'll get to that later. So a mere consequence stating a contradiction can generate an inference by implying an other renowned syllogism, as I mentioned before. Right, so that is actually Jetsun Chökyi Gelson's opinion again. Whether it needs to imply that at all is questionable. Whether you could just immediately have the valid cognizer, the inferential valid cognizer, just by knowing the consequence, or whether in your own mind you need to fill in the blanks and say, well, there is the syllogism, then thereby it is produced from it is not produced from self. There's different opinions on that. So I'm following the Sarah J opinion here. And says, in any case, Buddhapalita does state a reason in the extent of explanation that Bhavaviveka ignored. The subject is sprout. There is no point in it being produced again because it is already established in its own nature. And so as we saw before, that was there, but Bhavaviveka didn't understand that that was elaborating on the previous sentence. Now the second criticism, which is that you do not anticipate the Samkhya response, which was that, what do you mean by a sprout? Do you mean one that exists at the time of the cause, or sorry, the unmanifest sprout at the time of the cause, or do you mean the manifest sprout at the time of the result? But it says if one does not accept autonomous syllogism, there is no fault. So what does that mean? It means in our system, a sign can be correct without employing commonly appearing subjects. So that we'll get to as the second major part of this talk about what does that mean. So you don't need to state whether it's the unmanifest or the manifest sprout. You just say a sprout. And the explicitly stated subject is sprout. Madhyamaka understands that this as a non-inherently existent sprout. The Samkhya opponent understands this subject as a sprout that exists in an unmanifest way at the time of its cause. So when you say sprout, you mean something totally different. Now, what would that mean in a normal conversation? Well, what if one person was viewing an illusion? Somebody else knew it was an illusion, but the first person just thought it was really a horse. then they could have a conversation about the horse. The second person knows it's not really a horse, but they can still have a conversation with the first person about it and give them consequences about the horse. But they understand it in a completely different way. One person thinks this is a horse. One person thinks it is a real horse. One person thinks this is a dream horse or an illusory horse. But that's irrelevant to the questions they can ask each other within the convention of what they're seeing. So furthermore, Samkhya understands the concordant example as a manifest sprout. Right? So Chandakirti is saying that they actually understand the manifest sprout as the example based on Buddhapalita's extensive explanation. But Viveka does not understand that the Samkhya would understand it that way, would understand it as saying, for example, a manifest sprout. So we could say the subject, an unmanifest sprout, it follows that there is no point in it being produced because it is already existing, for example, a manifest sprout. That would be a very good reason to give to them, actually. We could say, well, if a manifest sprout already exists and doesn't need to be produced again, then why should an unmanifest sprout be like that? Basically, the point is, what do you even mean by an unmanifest sprout? Is an unmanifest sprout a sprout? If they say no, then, well, what's the whole point of you positing a sprout that exists at the time of a cause? If they say yes, well then, if it's a sprout, why does it need to be produced again? For example, a manifest sprout. Okay. Hello? Oh, you can't, yeah, you have to send a request. Where are you?
Show yourself me.
But also, is the audio on? Okay, can you hear me? I'm using the student's computer here. Okay, good.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Hello. What happened?
We are
so-
making you a co-host again from this.
Okay, I'm going to try to share. Yeah. Okay. You can all see that? It's I'm getting used to the new computer here. You can hear me, but can you see me? Yeah. Okay. How do I make this full screen?
Yes.
There's the play button, but first scroll down to the slide.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, but let me just make it. How do I make it full screen?
Yeah, that one.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the wrong one there. Okay, now I lost that.
Let's click anywhere.
Okay. Okay. And now play. Well, I'll scroll on to the right slide and then. Okay. Now I can't see anyone as I could before, so I hope you can all follow me. It's nice to be able to see people sometimes, but anyway. So here we are. So we were saying, yes, that if you say to them that a sprout, I think we were saying that a sprout, if it exists at the time, a sprout that exists in an unmanifest way, if it's really a sprout, then why does it need to be produced again? Just like a manifest sprout. If it's not really a sprout, then there's no point in calling it an unmanifest sprout. We could say, well, Buddhists, we also accept unmanifest sprouts. If you by an unmanifest sprout, you mean a seed, then what's the point? What are you saying that's any different than us? So that's what they would be thrown into that consequence, according to Chandrakirti. You don't need to draw all those reasons out. It's enough just to say what Buddhapalita said. Okay. Okay, so now we have the third criticism, which is that he leaves himself open to attack. The attack being that he is implying something. It's an affirmative negation. So Buddhapalita's intended consequence is it follows that there is no point in it being produced again. Right? That's what we said before, the intended consequence, but then we have the misreading bhava viveka, which is it follows that its production is pointless and endless. The intended consequence does not state that it is produced. So the statement that bhava viveka says, well, you said that it was produced in your consequence. That's not true. He didn't read the consequence properly. And in any case, Buddhapalita does not intend to imply an autonomous syllogism. Thus, he does not commit himself to accepting the reverse of the consequence. And as we saw, he doesn't even think you need to switch the predicate and the sign. So he doesn't not commit himself to accepting the opposite. It's not meant to be a consequence that implies a syllogism, in the sense that it implies the opposite of the predicate and the sign. Okay, so now we have Chandrakirti's offensive, as I mentioned at the beginning. This is the second part. This is commonly appearing subjects. So Chandrakirti has defended Buddhapalita, and now he's going to come back and attack bhava viveka, and say that his way he's talking shows that he misunderstands what emptiness actually means. So this is how he begins. This logician, referring to bhava viveka, intending to showcase his remarkable proficiency in the logical treatises, even while adhering to the Madhyamaka view, declares an autonomous syllogism. Understand this as the source of a whole heap of colossal faults. And so he uses the word logician in a derogatory way here, as we see. The word is dokewa in Tibetan. And actually, interestingly, that word is usually used in a derogatory way in most of our texts. Not always, because in a general sense, it just means the use of logic. But usually we'll see that as an example of people who, to understand the profound meaning, and just talk and talk and talk about logic. It's also perhaps a bit of a play on the title of one of bhava viveka's important texts. Not this one, but another one you may have heard of, Blaze of Reasoning, which is his auto-commentary on his text, The Heart of the Middle Way. The name Blaze of Reasoning in Sanskrit is Takarjvala, I believe. In Sanskrit, Doke Bara. So the reasoning in that term, Blaze of Reasoning, is this same word here, logic, logician. So he's saying the person who thinks he's a logician because he wrote this text called Blaze of Reasoning or Blaze of Logic, now he's going to try to show how great his logic is, but by doing so, he falls into affirming inherent existence. And thereby he loses his status as a Madhyamaka. So what is the syllogism? This is the Buddhapalita syllogism that we had before, right? We talked about this before. I apologize. It's displaying differently on this computer than it did on mine, so you can't quite see all of the words, but I think you get the point. Oh, sorry, no, this isn't the one that we talked about before. I made a mistake in saying that. This is the syllogism that Buddhapalita uses in his text, Blades of Reasoning. So he says, you shouldn't argue the way Buddhapalita argued. This is a better way to negate production from self. He says the inner sense sources, such as the eyes, right? The inner sense sources mean the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body. So it says, ultimately are not produced from themselves because they exist. For example, like a knower. Now, by knower, he's actually talking about the Samkhya understanding. If any of you know anything about Samkhya philosophy, and I'm guessing most of you don't, so I can just explain briefly what that is, they believe that existence is composed of 25 elements. The most important of these are the first one, which is called Purusha, or self, also knower. So pure consciousness. It's the only thing in existence that is not a result or a cause. It's just simply independent of everything else. Pure consciousness, not the objects of consciousness, not emotions and things like that, but just a pure mere awareness. Whereas everything else that exists is called prakriti, the essential nature. So that's the second of the 25. The remaining 23 are all just the manifestations of that prakriti. So the mistake that a person makes in the reason they fall into samsara, because they also have that idea, is that they confuse that the pure awareness is somehow tied in with the manifestations of the fundamental essence, essential nature. So by extracting themselves from that, they're no longer involved in the phenomenal world, and they can be liberated. So it's not produced from anything. So he uses that as an example, a knower. So he says, ultimately, things are not produced from themselves because they exist. So he says that could prove to them that things are not, that a sprout, for example, is not produced from itself. If it exists in the same way a knower exists, why should one be a product and one not be? So then Chandrakirti comes back and says, why did you add the qualifier ultimately? He says, so you see, Buddhapalita in his sign here, because he posits a syllogism, right? He does not posit a consequence. He said, ultimately, they are not produced from themselves. Now, why does he say that? Now, Chandrakirti's questions is what we call putsam in Tibetan. It's not really what he meant. If we want to understand why did he say that things are ultimately, it's because he doesn't think that conventionally they're produced from self either. But he uses the term ultimately in all four consequences, or all four syllogisms, sorry. So he uses it similarly when he talks about production from other. He says ultimately they are not produced from self, not ultimately produced from other. Because he does think that conventionally they're produced from other. That's the reason he says that, which Chandrakirti disagrees with. He says they're not even conventionally coming from other. However, he asks these leading questions here, which is getting at a different point. This point about the commonly appearing subject. So this is, I said, rikpe putsam in Tibetan. It's like offering him back the consequences of his own reasoning. So if you say ultimately, did you intend to qualify the prabandham, self-production, or the predicate? So when you say ultimately they're not produced from themselves, are you saying the production is not, self-production is not ultimately true? But there's no reason to say that, because there's no need to do so for a Madhyamaka who does not accept self-production even conventionally. So you should just say they're not produced from themselves. You shouldn't say they're ultimately not produced from themselves. And nor is there a need for a Samkhya opponent for whom it is suitable to negate self-production both ultimately and conventionally. right? So why would you go halfway? You've proven to them that there's no ultimate self-production, then you have to go and prove to them that there's no conventional self-production. Why not just start with saying there's no self-production? And nor is there a need for ordinary people. This is actually an important point about the Prasangika, who don't talk about self-production or other production. So Bhavaviveka might say, well, of course things are produced from others. We all see that. Everyone just talks about that. If you ask somebody in the world, is it produced from itself or produced from something else, they would say it's produced from something else. Now, if questioned on the issue, they would probably say that. But that's not usually how they talk. People don't even ask those questions. They just say they're produced. And Chandrakirti takes that seriously. That's just the way that people talk. That's just the way they understand things in what we call innate valid cognition, meaning it's unexamined. We just see it that way. We don't question, well, what is it really? What is the nascent essence of a sprout? We just see, well, sprouts come from seeds. It's innate in the sense it's instinctive, might be a better way to put it. We'll talk about that a bit later too. So, and the Chandrakirti, as some of you might know, and I won't get into that now, but he explains that in the world, people don't really think things are produced from other. And one of the examples he uses, which is very interesting because the example works in Sanskrit and in Tibetan and in English. So people use the same kind of expression in all three languages. He says, I'm planting a tree. A person doesn't say, or they could, but they don't usually say, I'm planting a seed. But that is what they're doing. They're not putting a tree in the ground. But it shows that they don't really think of the tree and the sprout, or the tree and the seed, as two entirely different things. Otherwise, they wouldn't say, I'm planting a tree. They would say, I'm planting a seed, which is going to become a tree. But it shows that they already have this sense of them as being related in some way. But anyway, as I said, that's not the main point here, so I won't get into that. The main point is that you don't need to say ultimately. You don't need to say it in terms of the prabandham or the predicate. So he's shown that there's no reason to say it there, so now he goes into a different point. He says, or did you intend to qualify the subject? Because if you didn't, obviously you didn't intend to qualify the predicate. Now, as I said, he did intend to qualify the predicate. But Chandrakirti is leading him into a different point. He's saying, well, it didn't make any sense to qualify the predicate. So maybe you meant to qualify the subject, the eyes. So maybe you meant to say, ultimate eyes are not produced from themselves. But again, there's a problem. For a Madhyamaka, the subject ultimate eyes is not established. There's no such, so the subject would not be established. And for Samkhya, conventional eyes are not established. So if you say ultimate eyes, it doesn't work. So then maybe you say the subject conventional eyes. It follows that they are not, or they are not produced from themselves. But then Samkhya can't argue. So you can't say ultimate eyes, you can't say conventional eyes. So then Bhavaviveka might respond, and Chandrakirti says, well, maybe he would say, well, maybe you think it's adequate to use a generic subject, eyes, that is qualified neither as ultimate nor conventional, a commonly appearing subject. We both agree that eye exists, eyes. We don't need to say ultimate eyes or conventional eyes, we just say eyes. Doesn't seem to be a problem, does it? So here's an example of a generic subject. When the Sautantrika, so here's another Buddhist school, right? The school of Dharmakirti and so forth, they debate with the Vaisesika, which is another non-Buddhist school. Look at this happen. Dharmakirti debated with them about this. About the impermanence of sound, it is adequate to use the generic subject sound. Right? We just say the subject sound. It is impermanent, or it follows that it is not produced because it is permanent. We don't say sound in the way that the Buddhist understands it or the way the Vaisheshika understands it. We just talk about sound. So we say the subject impermanent sound would not be established for the opponent. The Vaisheshika does not believe it's impermanent. So you can't say the subject impermanent sound. It follows that it is not produced because it's permanent. They wouldn't agree with that. But then the sound that is a quality of space, which is how a Vaiseshika understands it, would not be established for a Buddhist. So we employ a commonly appearing subject, sound. We don't say impermanent sound or the subject quality of space sound, we just say sound. That works in that context. So why can't we just say eyes here and not ultimate eyes or conventional eyes? But the example does not work in the present context. If we use the subject eyes, not qualified by either deceptive or non-deceptive, because that is the meaning of ultimate. Ultimate means the object of an ultimate consciousness, a non-deceptive consciousness, a consciousness that is correct in the way it sees things. Whereas conventional means the object of a deceptive consciousness or a deceived consciousness. This is, I can't talk too much about that now, we don't have enough time, but this is a very important point in what is the difference here. So we're not just talking about the eyes, are they permanent, are they impermanent, are they subject to space? We're talking about, do we even agree that there's such a thing as an eye that's established by valid cognition? That much has to be agreed upon. We don't have to agree about whether they're impermanent or whether they're quality of space, but we do have to agree that they're established by valid cognition to have a discussion about something. So we have to decide, well, what does it mean to be established by valid cognition? So if we say, I think they're ultimate and you think they're conventional, it means that I think they're established by non-deceptive valid cognition. You think they're established by deceptive valid cognition. So it assumes that we agree that they're established by valid cognition and that we agree on what is meant by valid cognition. So Samkhya, from their side, accepts that a non-deceptive consciousness accesses the actual mode of being of the eyes. Madhyamakas say, or ought to say, that only deceptive, right? The word conventional, concealer, you might know this. The word conventional in Tibetan, kunzop, right? It's the same in Sanskrit. It means a concealer. It doesn't really mean conventional in the way we use the word in English. Only concealer consciousness establishes conventionalities. So we have a completely different understanding of what it means to be established by valid cognizers. Now we say they ought to say, because Bhavaviveka, if he really understands the Madhyamaka system, he ought to say that. But if he argues that, well, we can just talk about a commonly appearing subject between ourselves and the Samkhya, then it shows he doesn't understand there's a big difference between a Madhyamaka and a Samkhya in terms of how they understand how we establish things in the world. So we have, you can't have your cake and eat it too. This is the fundamental problem with Bhavaviveka's system. He says, Shantakirti says, if you say that deceptive consciousness accesses the conventional mode of being of the object, which is what Bhavaviveka is implying. He's implying that we first establish the object and then we argue about it. So first we have to establish what it is conventionally. Chandakirti says that is tantamount to accepting a common locus of a non-deceptive and a deceptive consciousness. Because you've said that a conventional consciousness establishes the mode of being of the object. So it's a conventional consciousness, it's a deceptive. But it establishes the mode of being, so it must be non-deceptive. So this consciousness is non-deceptive because that's what I just said. It accesses a mode of being. It's deceptive because it establishes conventional reality. So it's like we say conventional real things. It's like saying mistaken real things. It contradicts itself to say that there is a mode of being that is conventional. So in Chandakirti's system, there is no such thing as a conventional mode of being. A mode of being, by its very meaning of it, is it's ultimately true. So Chandakirti is saying that Bhavaviveka, he actually looks too far to try to understand emptiness. He thinks that there's the mode of being, but then there's the truly existent mode of being. But when he says mode of being, what he really means is a truly existent mode of being, or really an inherently existent mode of being. But for Chandrakirti, that's the same thing. So finally, you cannot say that his object is accessed by a non-deceptive consciousness, yet at the same time is a mere conventionality, not truly existent. That's the whole meaning of conventionality, is it's established only by deceptive consciousness. If it was established by a non-deceptive consciousness, then it would be ultimately true. It's unmistakable. We found the real thing. So now, Bhavaviveka has been backed into a corner. He says, so Chandrakirti says to him, you might respond, the eyes are not accessed by a mind comprehending their mode of being. Right? That would be really what a Madhyamaka should say. But Chandrakirti says, you are forced to say that they are, because you have accepted that the eyes are cognized by a non-deceptive mind, which is what Bhavaviveka does say. Or he seems to be implying, at least. It's not entirely clear. But this is why we say that for Bhavaviveka, conventional consciousness, for example, sense consciousness, is non-mistaken. You might know that if you study tenets at all. Things appear as they are, in a conventional way. So, because the reason he's accepted that is that you've accepted that there's one that's unmistaken to the inherent nature of the eyes, because you've said that we and Samkhya both agree on a commonly appearing subject. You're implying that we both agree that consciousness accesses the mode of being of its object. And the inherent nature is a mode of being from its own side, right? Something that exists before you analyze it, in the sense that it exists in a particular way that everyone, if they examined it, would find the exact same thing. Because it's the way it's established is a priori to the way that you talk about it. There's a world out there waiting to be found. Now we're back up for a minute. That was the argument that was made, but then we talked about autonomous syllogism. So what does it mean when Chandrakirti says we don't accept autonomous syllogisms? That is also a point of debate, and something that it seems that Jayananda, who was Chandrakirti's commentator, is not his student. It was 400 years or 600 years later, but he was an important commentator. He seems that he wrongly understood this. Now, Jayananda, just briefly, he actually came to Tibet in the 12th century, and I believe he wrote the commentary in Tibetan. It's called the sub-commentary, which is a commentary on Chandrakirti's commentary, trying to explain his meaning. And it was very influential in Tibet, although it seems that Jayananda, he did have a debate with one Tibetan, I'm trying to remember who, and he lost the debate, so he left Tibet. But nevertheless, his commentary was very influential. And Tsongkhapa, he criticizes the commentary quite a lot. You might notice that if you're reading Illuminating the Intent, although I don't think he names him very much. That's one issue, because Tsongkhapa tends to do that. He's very polite. He doesn't like to attack people, so he doesn't actually say who he's attacking. But a lot of times he's saying that he misinterpreted Chandrakirti. So in any case, he understands when Chandrakirti says there's no such thing as an autonomous syllogism, he understands it as a syllogism whose three modes are established by valid cognition, right? Which, if you might know from your study of signs and reasons, that's the definition of a correct sign. So he says, Jayananda is saying Chandrakirti means there's such a syllogism is impossible. There's no such thing as a correct sign that is established by both the the challenger and the defender in an argument. He says, because the challenger in a debate cannot know the mind of his opponent. So if I'm arguing with you, I can't know that we both established something. So I can't really know that we both agree on what we're talking about. Nor can the challenger be certain that his own cognition is correct. It could be deceptive. So I could think I know that sound is a product, but how do I really know I'm right? I could be deceived. But this is Tsongkhapa responds to this. The second point here is Tsongkhapa responding to Jayananda, saying, then what's the point of arguing? Because you can't really know what the other person accepts. If you can't really know somebody else's mind, because Jayananda says,
He can't know the other person's mind. He doesn't have clairvoyance. You can't know the person's mind through a correct reason. You can't prove what somebody thinks through a correct reason. Then what's the point of arguing? I don't really know what anyone else thinks, so why do I even argue with them? And furthermore, if you can't even know that your own cognition is correct, then you might think that you have a sound argument, but you could be deceived. So why argue? Maybe you're wrong. Right? Why be so certain of your own position? So therefore, the three modes do need to be established by valid cognition. This is Tsongkhapa's unique understanding of Chandrakirti. It said that his unique approach to emptiness was to combine Chandrakirti's understanding of emptiness with Dharmakirti's understanding of valid cognition. Right? In other Tibetan Buddhist schools, for example, in Sakya, they do not accept that conventional things are established by valid cognition. But Tsongkhapa said Chandrakirti is saying there is not a non-deceptive valid cognizer establishing conventionalities. Does not mean there is not a valid cognizer establishing conventionalities. What there is an innate or an instinctive valid cognizer, as I mentioned the name before. It doesn't say it's this or that, it just sees it in a conventional way. So the person who's looking at an illusory horse, it's completely an illusion, they're completely mistaken, but they're still correct that it's blue and not, or a blue horse would be unlikely, but they're still correct that it's a brown horse and not a black horse. So even though everything is a mistake, within that system, they can still have a valid cognizer within the convention. And if somebody says it's black, they can argue with them and convince them that it's not. They can say, well, it looks black to you because it's in the shadow. And the person can figure out that they're correct. So you don't have to have a non-deceptive valid cognizer to be able to have an argument about something. So they're not established by a valid cognizer that accesses their mode of being. The people talking about the illusion are both talking about a horse, but there's no such thing. There's nothing out there that's a horse. But within the convention, it's true. So neither Bhavaviveka nor Jayananda recognized this difference. So Bhavaviveka went to the extreme of said it is established by a valid cognizer that accesses this mode of being. That's what the meaning of a valid cognizer is. Jayananda says it's not established by any valid cognizer at all, because if it was, it would have to establish the mode of being. Chandrakirti is saying, way, it's established by prerequisite for something being a valid cognizer. An autonomous syllogism. Definition I've taken from Kedrupje. He gives a very clear definition of an autonomous syllogism. So something that is framed as a syllogism, right? So the subject, this, it is that because this reason, that proves a probandum that the defender wants to know. Right? That much is okay. Like we all agree that's what a syllogism is. But then wherein the challenger and defender are in consensus. So the consensus is another way of translating common appearance. They agree that the subject is located by a valid cognizer, unmistaken to its object of comprehension. Right? That much, there's no such thing in terms of conventional truth. There is no such thing as a conventional valid cognizer unmistaken to its object of comprehension. And even more so, an object of comprehension established by way of its own characteristics that exist in a particular way that we are both accessing before we both decide how it exists. For Chandrakirti, nothing exists that way, not even ultimate truth. It's not established by way of its own characteristics. It's ultimate truth, but it's not ultimately true. That's an important distinction. So what do we mean by a commonly appearing subject? This definition I've taken, this is not something that I've seen in any of the traditional texts by Tsongkhapa, Kedrupje. It's something that nowadays in debate, people tend to have this understanding of how would we define a commonly appearing subject if we were to ask, because it's not defined by Tsongkhapa. So the sort of valid cognizer that establishes the subject, such as sound, according to the defender's system of tenets, is the same sort of valid cognizer that establishes the subject according to the challenger's system of tenets. So we both agree on what kind of valid cognizer we're talking about. So if I'm talking to you about an illusory horse, and I know it's an illusion, I'm just saying horse though, for your understanding, and you think it's a real horse, we have a very different understanding of what kind of mind is establishing the horse. I think a mistaken eye consciousness is the seeing the horse. You think a unmistaken eye consciousness is seeing the horse. So that is not a commonly appearing subject. So one question we make in debate is, are there commonly appearing subjects? Tsongkhapa doesn't make that, doesn't ever say, he says in this context there shouldn't be, but he doesn't ever say, is there ever such a thing? And again, that's quite a point of debate. Different people take different positions, but anyway, the position that I took, it seemed to work best in debate, and it seems to be what a lot of people take, is that there are in certain contexts. It doesn't mean they're inherently existing, but for example, between two prasangikas who agree that a conventional subject is established by a deceptive consciousness, there are, because they agree. We both agree that the kind of valid cognizer that establishes it is a deceptive kind. So it's like we're both viewing an illusory horse, and we both know that it's an illusion, but we just use the word horse as a convention because we're trying to talk about it. So we're looking at an illusory horse, and I say it's brown, and you say it's black, and I say, no, see, because it looks black for this and this reason. I mean, that actually is a bit funny, because the black from the perspective of their illusion, but maybe a better way to say it is, it looks like a horse, and to you it looks like a cow. And I say, no, actually it's a horse. We both know it's an illusion, but we try to say, what is it? What are they trying to make an illusion of? And so we don't have to say, oh, it's an illusory horse, not an illusory cow. I can just say it's a horse, not a cow. We both know that it's not really a horse, but we can use that convention. And we're in consensus about what we're talking about. So between two prasangikas, there can be a commonly appearing subject. Between two propounders of true existence who agree that a conventional subject is established by a non-deceptive consciousness, likewise, there are commonly appearing subjects. So for two people who are seeing an illusory horse, they agree on what they're talking about. They're both wrong, but they agree on we're talking about a horse that's seen by a non-deceptive eye, an eye consciousness that is non-mistaken. Now, between Bhava-viveka and Samkhya, it's not clear whether there's a commonly appearing subject. That's a point of debate also. But the main point is there ought not to be if Bhava-viveka is a true Madhyamaka, whereas he seems to assume that there is. He seems to say, well, we can employ a commonly appearing subject because we both agree on what eyes are. So now we have this term, innate valid cognizers, which I'd said probably is instinctive valid cognizers would be a better way to understand this. So contrary to a common misconception, even for the prasangika system, a correct sign must be established by valid cognition by both parties. So when we say an inference for an other renowned syllogism, it doesn't mean that you think it's a correct sign and I don't. That's not the meaning of another renowned syllogism. So there is common appearance or consensus inasmuch as both parties establish the same three modes. But the three modes, meaning of a sign, so the property of the subject, the forward pervasion, the reverse pervasion, they can be established by an innate or an unreflective valid cognizer, not necessarily one that exists in a way that both sides acknowledge. So, like I said, people in the world, they know that sprouts come from seeds. They don't even ask the question, does it come from a cell itself or from something else? So we just established that without even having to ask such kinds of questions. So in terms of the Madhyamaka debating with the Samkhya, they can debate with them about sprouts without getting into the question of, are they sprouts that exist at the time of the cause, or are they non-inherently existent sprouts? they both establish it. Generally speaking, Samkhya knows what a sprout is. They're not so stupid that they don't plant seeds to create sprouts, because they know that seeds come from sprouts. Sorry, sprouts come from seeds. But then philosophically, according to the Madhyamaka, they're making this error by saying that sprouts actually come from non-manifest sprouts that exist in the seed. Right? But in terms of conventional reality, they function perfectly well in the ordinary world. And the Madhyamaka does it too. They understand that it's not inherently existent, but they nevertheless plant a seed if they want to have a sprout. So now remember Chandrakirti, he said, understand this to be a whole heap of colossal faults. When Bhavaviveka says that he posits it in an autonomous syllogism. So what are those? What are those faults? As long as Bhavaviveka considers that a valid cognizer accesses the mode of being of the object, right, which is what he implied by saying that we both agree that something established by non-deceptive awareness, then a valid cognizer is by default a mind analyzing the ultimate. Because the only way anything can be unmistaken is if it's establishing ultimate truth. That's the whole meaning of ultimate truth. Something established by a unmistaken valid cognizer, according to Chandrakirti, which is how he understands Nagarjuna's thought. He's saying that's what Nagarjuna really meant. The only thing that is unmistaken is the direct perception of reality. Everything else is mistaken. Secondly, if you consider that a valid cognizer accesses the mode of being of the object, then all three modes of the sign must be commonly appearing to both opponents. So we said, at least some people have the opinion, that there can be commonly appearing signs, commonly appearing subjects, commonly appearing signs, commonly appearing predicates, but they don't have to be. Right? The two prasangikas can have an argument or a conversation, but they can also have a conversation or an argument with a samkhya. We don't have to agree philosophically on what something is in order to have a discussion about it. But if the valid cognizers had to access the mode of being, then we would have to agree. Because if we both had valid cognizers establishing the subject, which is a prerequisite for having an argument about it, at least in a meaningful way, right? If you're completely mistaken about what we're talking about, I say horse and you think I mean cow, you think the word horse is talking about a cow, then we can't really have a discussion about it. But we don't need to have a commonly appearing subject in terms of, we need to, from both of us, have to have a subject that is established by a valid cognizer, but we don't have to have an understanding of what a valid cognizer is in the same way. But if a valid cognizer accessed its mode of being, then really we would have to, because everything that was established by valid cognition by you and by me would be understood in exactly the same way by you and me, because there's a real thing that we're accessing, and when you access it, you establish the real thing. So we both agree on every single detail of how it exists, not necessarily of is it blue or red, but in terms of what it means an existent thing. And then thirdly, there can never be a generic subject, not qualified as deceptive or non-deceptive. So this is what Chandrakirti was saying. You say we could just posit a generic subject, but if a valid cognizer accesses the mode of being of something, then any subject has to be a non-deceptive subject. To be established by valid cognition, it has to, by definition, be a non-deceptive thing, be an ultimately established thing. So there would be no such thing as something that is neither, we don't talk about it as conventional ultimate, we just agree on it, on what it is. It would have to be ultimately true or ultimately real if it was established by valid cognition. And as I said before, Bhavaviveka, he falls into that trap, whereas Jayananda goes the opposite and says, well, yes, if it was established by valid cognition, it would have to be ultimately real. Thereby, nothing is established by valid cognition. But Chandrakirti's point is that valid cognition does not by accepting valid cognition, you do not hold yourself to accepting that it is ultimately real. Those things can be distinguished. So now finally, we see this valid cognizer does not exist. So meaning, if a valid cognizer had these three characteristics, which is what Bhavaviveka is implying, then it wouldn't really be a valid cognizer. There's no such thing as a valid cognizer with these three, according to Chandrakirti. So one, it does not realize that the eyes are established by their own nature. Two, nor does it realize that they are not established by their own nature. But three, yet it comprehends the nature of eyes as such and such. Right, so for Chandrakirti, the first two are okay. But if it comprehends the nature of eyes and such, then it is establishing how they exist. So it has to know either they are or are not established by their own nature. So a valid cognizer that understands the nature of eyes and such either understands that the nature of eyes is ultimately empty, or it understands that the nature of the eyes is ultimately real. There's no other conventional way that they exist. There's no other conventional nature, like a stop on the road to the final nature. If there was, that would be the final nature. It would be something that was found under analysis. So the example here that I've been giving before about the horse, we can see why Bhavaviveka's statement is absurd if we frame it in terms of an example. So to say, first access the object with a non-deceptive cognition, and then analyze whether it truly exists, which is essentially what Bhavaviveka is saying. First, establish the subject of the argument with a valid cognizer, which for Bhavaviveka means a non-deceptive valid cognizer. Once you've done that, then analyze whether it truly exists. So that would be like saying, first locate the illusory horse, and then check whether or not it is a horse, whether or not it is a real horse. That doesn't make any sense. How can you locate an illusory horse? Once you've located the illusory horse, well, there's no need to check if it's a real horse. It can't be. It's an illusion. So if you say, first find the actual thing and then check if it's real, well, that statement, the earlier and later parts of it contradict each other. To say first find the real thing that we're looking for and then check how it exists. Once you've found it, you've shown that it ultimately exists. It's real. It's findable. But Bhavaviveka wants to say that it's findable, but it's not ultimately true or ultimately real. But Chandrakirti is saying that that doesn't make any sense. So, okay, that's the end of the talk here, of the slides. Do you mind to come here? I need to, the mouse isn't showing up. So what is, okay, stop, yeah, stop share. Okay, so those are the slides. And what time? Yeah, it's okay. So I think now it's good that we can have question and answer, because those are the main points. Now, just to summarize briefly everything that we've talked about. So we have the first part, which was about the reverse consequence, right? So Bhavaviveka, Chandrakirti is defending Buddhapalita's use of a consequence against Bhavaviveka's attack. That was the basis for talking about commonly appearing subjects. But it's not that we should confuse that there was anything about that in that argument, right? It was just that Bhavaviveka was saying Buddhapalita argues in a wrong way. He's not saying he misunderstands emptiness. But then Chandrakirti comes back and says, first of all, he did not argue in a wrong way. But the fact that you think he argued in a wrong way shows that you don't understand emptiness. And then he goes on to talk about commonly appearing subjects and to say that your assumption that there is a commonly appearing subject between you and a Samkhya shows that you're not really a Madhyamaka. Now, Tsongkhapa says, I'm not sure, and this might actually be in Chandrakirti's text. I haven't seen it, but he said he might be paraphrasing him, but is Chandrakirti saying he's not really a Madhyamaka? He says, no, he is really a Madhyamaka, because he does try to use reasons to establish that things do not truly exist. But he does break the rules of a Madhyamaka. And he says the example is a monk who breaks the vows, not the root vows maybe, but or even the argues about non-true existence, but he's gone against the fundamental tenets of a Madhyamaka by saying that things are findable under analysis. So he's broken the rules, and he's behaved properly. He's not really a true monk maybe in a figurative sense. So why is this so important? As I said, this shows very clearly what Chandrakirti means by emptiness, and yet still at the same time, that valid cognizer can be deceived about the way the thing actually exists. No other Buddhist school accepts that that's possible, except for Chandrakirti in the Prasangika school. They all say that if something is established by valid cognition, it's establishing the way it actually is. That's the meaning of valid cognizers. So I'll leave that at that. If we have questions, now I see there's already a couple in the chat. So first of all, an unmanifest line at the time of its result. Well, the point was that for Samkhya, the result exists in an unmanifest way at the time of the cause, right? So things now, why would somebody think something like that? It seems silly, maybe you might say, but one of the reasons seems to be, why does a horse embryo turn into a horse and not a cow? There has to be something there in the cause that leads it. It's called the teleological in Western philosophy, that leads it to develop in a particular way. Otherwise, it would just be random. Because there's nothing, if we look at a horse embryo, it looks very much like a cow embryo. Now, nowadays, scientists would argue, well, there's a particular DNA in the horse embryo. Now, I think that's a different argument. It might, in some sense, beg the question, because there's some question of, well, what about the horse DNA? What about those genes caused it to develop in that particular way? Right? We know that it does. We can read the genetic code because we've seen other genetic codes that cause it to develop that way. But a priori, looking at the genetic code, where does it say this is a horse? So what is it about it that makes it develop that way? That's a different question, but I would say this is still a question today, if we really ask in philosophy. But at the time, they didn't know anything about genetics, of course. So they had a question about why does a seed of barley give rise to a barley sprout and not a wheat sprout? So there has to be something in the seed of the barley that gives rise to a particular kind of sprout. So they argued, well, there's this unmanifest thing, but then the Buddhists come back to them with these absurd consequences. So Dharmakirti gives one, actually. He says, well, thereby, one blade of grass contains 100 elephants, because one elephant eats that grass and then has many child elephants, progeny, and then for many generations, that one blade of grass is the cause of all of these future generations. So they all exist in that blade of grass. So that blade of grass has to be pretty heavy, right? If you follow the consequences of saying that, it seems a bit absurd. But anyway, they, of course, their system was, again, as I said before, these people were not stupid. They were very intelligent philosophers. And the Samkhya school has been very influential in India. It still is influential. And so they had a very subtle way of arguing back about that. It's not just so blatantly absurd. But anyway, that's a different question, just to give a little bit of a talk about, what are they arguing about here? So now we have a question for the end. Samkhya, based on their tenets, might answer, to the consequence that production is purposeless, they might answer, no pervasion, because sprout, unmanifest at the time of the seed, depends on conditions to become manifest. So when we say production is purposeless, right, we mean that if something is already produced, there's no reason for it to be produced again. So yes, if we say an unmanifest sprout depends on conditions but to become manifest, there's some purpose in that. But the question then is, when you say unmanifest sprout, as I mentioned this before, is it a sprout or not? You're forced to answer one way or the other. What do you mean by unmanifest sprout? If it is a sprout, then it does not depend on conditions to become manifest. It's a sprout. If it's not a sprout, then what does it mean to say the result exists at the time of the cause? Right? Is there a little sprout inside the seed? If you had a microscope, would you see it? If not, then what does it mean? There might be a potential. So are you calling a potential an unmanifest sprout? Well, then we agree. There is a potential, but we don't agree that there's actually a sprout in there. So they might argue back that way, but as I said before, it would be very good. We don't do that so much in the monastery, but it would be very good if people are interested to actually look at what the Samkhya are saying and try to see, well, how would they respond? Because obviously they still exist, at least I don't think as an independent school anymore, but their thinking has influenced a lot of modern Hindu schools. So it wasn't so blatantly obvious that the argument was wrong. So it was good to look at what they were saying. And I don't have enough knowledge of it to be able to go any more deeply into it. Now, to the consequence, it would be produced endlessly, they might answer. No pervasion, because there's no certainty that conditions required to make a sprout manifest would exist in perpetuity to produce endless sprouts. Okay, I guess we could ask them, well, what are those conditions? Right? So if those conditions were fulfilled, could a sprout give rise to another sprout? Right? The same with the unmanifest sprout, when there was certain conditions fulfilled, gave rose to a manifest sprout. Well, why can't you just plant a manifest sprout in the ground and water it? Why won't it also sprout like the unmanifest sprout, which is the seed? That might be one way to argue it. But again, as I say, I think that's an important question. I can't speak for them. I'm not sure what they would say. So I won't say any more about it here. But thank you. Those are both very good questions. So anyone else have a question? No.
Is there questions in the Lama Yeshi room from the master program students? Yes. You need to unmute, Maya. Unmute the computer, please.
It's okay.
Yes.
So there is one question that I mean, of course, still I need to digest the material. So we said that the minimum conventionality is that it's established by deceptive awareness, but the Buddha has conventionality. I mean, we talked about it today. We just touched the topic today when we were studying about this, and I was wondering.
You have questions you can ask.
And I was wondering how, I mean, we still try, of course, we just touched it. So I'm still trying to.
Is there any way to say it into the microphone, or is it going to be difficult? One of the students here has a question. Okay.
So that maybe I go to the computer.
Oh, sorry. Someone's asking a question there. So why don't we let them do that? Yes, hello?
No, you speak to the microphone, Maya.
Okay. Can
Yes.
you hear me now? Okay.
Oh,
so
I can't hear you.
I don't know what to do. Can
It's
you hear
coming
me?
out, the sound coming out of there, isn't there? No. Yeah, there's no sound from here.
Okay, Carlotta, do you want to try to say the question?
Sure.
Okay, I'll say it again. 1 second.
Just yeah, tell me and I'll repeat it.
I don't hear the host either, actually.
He doesn't hear me either. So
I think it's something to do with, I think she's speaking in Italian and then it gets translated.
Oh, okay.
And there's this interpretation,
Okay.
but I'm not exactly sure how it works.
Oh, okay.
Try not. Now can you hear?
Okay. Well, anyway, we have this on the chat. Maybe that's the easiest way. So
maybe just drop
why
it.
was Bhavaviveka bringing in Samkhya positions when he was a Buddhist and presumably a holder of Buddhist tenets? Well, he wasn't bringing in Samkhya positions as his own system. The point is that in the context of the first verse of Nagarjuna's text, he said, things are not produced from self, nor other, nor both, nor neither, or causelessly. So then he's arguing again, he's trying to show why they're not produced in any of those four ways. So to show that they're not produced from self, which is the first of those four, he argues against the view that they are produced from self. And he uses the example of a Samkhya who thinks that they are. So he uses that as, like we say, a foil, an example of somebody who says they are existent, born from self, and shows why that is absurd. What are the absurd consequences of showing something that is established from self? It's not that he's saying we agree with Samkhya, although as Chandrakirti says, when you say that we agree in as much as we agree on what a sprout is, we have a common understanding, a consensus, then you're actually getting a little bit too close to their system. You're allowing yourself to fall into their trap of thinking things exist in the way that they appear to us. Okay, I still can't hear, but maybe it's best to type the questions.
Maya, can you write the question in the chat, please? I don't hear you. I don't hear you. Tommy?
I guess it must be a very long question. Waiting for the typed response.
Tommy, are you writing a question or no questions? I cannot hear you. You have to unmute.
The interpretation.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Italian. Because their audio is going to be in Italian.
Okay, well, anyway, we've got it written out here. Okay, from Dunya. When there's such a wide gap in appearances of the subject, How can you ever really bridge it to get the opposing party on the same page? For example, in public discourse, some people might think that the subject is the government is fighting for the people and doing wonderful things, while others qualify the same subject as suppressing human rights and being authoritarian. Would there need to be a lot of intermediary steps before anything at all could be convincingly proven about the subject? And likewise for eyes, sprouts, etc. I think Chandrakirti's point is that there doesn't need to be. That we don't need to bring everyone into our way of seeing things to help them to understand. Because the purpose of an argument, if I'm compassionate, I'm not arguing trying to beat everyone in debate. I want to help people to bring them to a right understanding, is to start where they are. So rather than telling them, no, you're wrong, the government doesn't suppress us, which isn't, they're not going to listen to me, I try to understand their position and work within that. And I say, well, okay, so we say the government suppresses all, what is it? We're going back, all human rights. Then I might just make a little bit of adjustment in that. I might say, well, it follows that the government doesn't allow you to have a family. And they might say, well, they do. And I say, well, then it follows they don't suppress all human rights. And they might be forced to agree, and they might be okay to agree with that. Whereas if I give them more a consequence that's trying to just say them to them right away, oh, that's silly. Why would you say such a thing? And tell them, no, the government does not suppress all human rights because they protect our human rights. Then they're not going to listen to what I have to say. But if I say that in a way that points out to them a minor flaw, that it's undeniable to them, then they're likely to start to see things differently, and more importantly, perhaps, they're likely to be interested in what I have to say. So, whereas I've said this argument is very abstract here, it has very real-world consequences. I've sometimes said in past talks, trying to talk about commonly appearing subjects, which I've never done in a way nearly as in-depth as we just did now, but just to give a basic idea, I think one of the best examples of this that I've experienced was some of the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh that many of you might know, where he is arguing, not arguing is not the right word, on how he talks, but he was discussing about how to have discussions with Christians who were of the opinion that everybody, if you don't accept Jesus, then you're wrong, and there's no way that you can be saved. And his point, Thich Nhat Hanh's point, was that if I was to say to you that I accept Jesus, and just as you do, then my understanding of Jesus is going to be very different from yours. Because really what appears to, he didn't say it this way, I'm just elaborating on that. It's a very similar idea to what's being said here. What appears to my mind when I talk about this, it might be very different from what appears to your mind. It's actually quite almost impossible that we have a completely consensus idea on that. If we talk about, so I know you, don't you? And I talk about Dunyu, and your mother talks about Dunyu, we're almost talking about a different person. Because almost every experience I have of you is completely unique to any experience your mother has had of you, who knew you when you were a layperson in America. I know you when you were a monk in India. Yet at the same time, we can talk about the same person. We don't have to have the same establishment. And actually, it's correct. Conventionally, it's correct that we're talking about the same person. Whereas if I said Dunyu, but I meant another person named Dunyu, well, then we're on the same page. We're talking about something totally different. We don't realize it. We're talking about the same person, but we have a completely different appearance to our mind of what we're talking about, which is probably why one person might say, Dunyu is a really nice person, and somebody else might say, no, Dunyu is a really mean person. Well, actually, every experience I've had of it is like that, and the other person has experienced it in the opposite way. In some sense, we're both right in terms of what we experienced. So if I just come in and try to say to you, no, he's really mean, how could you say he's nice? Well, then you're going to you're going to say, no, he's really nice because he's always nice to me. So we're not actually able to meet and have any kind of discussion. But if I try to take your side and I say, well, okay, you think he's really nice. What about when he said such and such thing? Or I said, you give me an example. Then we can start to have some kind of consensus. But we cling to our ideas, our own appearance to mind, and assume that everyone experiences it the exact same way. Then we end up having. That's why it said this view of the self-existence is the root of all afflictions. It leads to all kinds of other arguments because we're misunderstanding a fundamental point that we're talking about. We experience the world in a different way, and we don't realize that the way we're experiencing it is very much dependent upon our state of mind. We assume that our state of mind is experiencing it in exactly the way it is. And so we assume that everyone either experiences it that way, or if they deny that, then they're wrong, because my experience of it is right. Nagarjuna says this very clearly in his text on the 60 stanzas. The 60 stanzas on the reasoning. He talks about from this view of the true self, when he talks about how that might seem like a neutral or a very harmless thing. He says, then from that come unbearably pernicious views, the cause of all argument and dispute in the world. And so he goes on about the snake. He gives the analogy of the view of self as a snake, that it has hold of you because you're trapped in this, and then everything you do becomes polluted by that. So I hope that, I think I answered your question. Let me go back here. Anyway, I think that gives a general idea, and I think I should move on to the next question. So, and I see you said it makes sense. Good. So we're on the same page now. So conventionalities are established by deceptive awareness, but I'm still confused by how does the Buddha see the true truths? Thanks, from Maya. Yeah, that's actually a debate that we have, that Tsongkhapa brings up, that we have in debate, because we say conventionalities are established by deceptive awareness. Well, somebody could say it follows that conventionalities are established by non-deceptive awareness, because conventionalities are established by the exalted knower of all aspects, the omniscient consciousness of a Buddha, which is non-deceptive. Right? Or what do you say to that? Well, basically the answer seems to be that there's two ways to answer it. And the basic point is that, yes, it doesn't mean that every single awareness that establishes it is non-deceptive, but the point is that the Buddha's awareness of emptiness, of reality, it is establishing ultimate truth from the perspective of how it sees emptiness. It's not mistaken to ultimate truth, but it's not the one that certifies. It's not mistaken to conventional truth, but it's not the certifier of conventional truth. So to give a more concrete example, right? So you're looking at an illusion. You see an illusory horse. I see that you're looking at an illusion, right? I see the way things really are, but actually you who sees the illusory horse is the real authority on how the horse looks. Conventional reality is established by conventional consciousnesses. The ultimate consciousness is not establishing it, it's seeing beyond it. But the way the conventional world looks, the authority on that is sentient beings who experience that world. The Buddha is seeing that everyone is living in an illusion. But the point isn't that the Buddha accesses the real nature of the illusion in sense of like the way things really are in a conventional sense, because there isn't any way they really are. The way it exists is the way it appears to you in terms of conventional reality. So the Buddha he's seeing beyond that to see that it's all just a dream for you that you're experiencing, but you're the authority of what you're experiencing in your dream. So the real establisher of conventions is conventional consciousnesses. which exist in sentient beings who experience conventional reality. The Buddha happens to also know what you're seeing, but that doesn't mean that it's real. So to say that a dream is real because it's established by a non-deceptive consciousness that sees that somebody dreaming, that's not the point. The point is it's not real for the person who's experiencing it as a dream, or experiencing it who's in the dream state. I hope that is helpful. It's it's a bit hard to talk about it, and I'd have to, for that point about the debate, I'd have to go look in the text again to see exactly the wording that Tsongkhapa uses. But I think that gets at the point. So it says, it seems that Bhavaviveka was overthinking. I agree. That seems to be what Chandrakirti is saying. He calls him the logician in a derogatory way. He says he goes too far. He doesn't see that emptiness is right there in front of us. It's the way we experience the world day to day. It's not something that esoteric that we have to keep looking more and more and more. As soon as we say, I see such and such thing, we're adhering to ultimate truth. We're adhering to inherent existence. It's just, we don't have to first establish things in the way they really are. So we're looking at an illusory horse. All I have to do to prove to you it's an illusion is just show you that it's being generated by a projector or whatever. I don't have to go into all the details and identify exactly what kind of horse it is, and then break it into its constituent parts, and then try to prove to you that constituent parts the whole can't be ultimately established by the constituents, and all of these kind of other arguments that Bhavaviveka uses. Okay, so then we have, I lost the line, sorry, is in the above question, deceptive awareness a translation of Tibetan Trilje? Yes, Trilje. Not Lokshe, no. Lokshe would be a wrong consciousness, right? So a wrong consciousness cannot be a valid cognizer, but a deceptive awareness can be. Now, in every Buddhist school, I'm not sure 100% about Bhashika, but that's kind of irrelevant. The main point is Sautantrika, who's kind of the classic example of the logicians who are a lower Buddhist school. Of course, they would say deceptive awareness can be a valid cognizer, because every inferential valid cognizer is deceptive. It's deceptive to the appearing factor. But the main thing is it's not deceptive to the ascertained factor, to the the object of the mode of apprehension. So a valid cognizer realizing, an inferential valid cognizer realizing that sound is impermanent, is mistaken to the way that impermanent sound appears to the consciousness, but it's not mistaken to impermanence. If it was, it would have to be a wrong consciousness. But for Prasangika, it is. It's mistaken to impermanence itself. But at the same time, it establishes it as impermanence. This becomes actually a problem for the Sautantrika view. If something is mistaken to the nature of the thing, it can't establish it. So they say if you see if a white snow mountain appears to you as blue, that's a wrong consciousness. It can't establish anything because it's not seeing things as they are. It's mistaken to its object of apprehension. It's object of the mode of apprehension, which is a blue mountain, a blue snow mountain. There's no blue snow mountain there. But the absurd consequence that I remember debating this many years ago when we debated about minds and awareness is that therefore it follows that a mind seeing a blue snow mountain can't establish the shape of the mountain. But it does. We know that. I can say that there's a very tall mountain there, even though I think it's blue and it's not, and I'm right that it's tall. So the Prasangika system works a little better there. It can be mistaken to what it's seeing. I can say I see a very tall mountain when actually it's just a cloud. That's completely mistaken, but I'm still right about the height. of how high it is in the sky. So something can be mistaken to something, but at the same time establish certain qualities of it or conventionalities about it. So it is said to be deceptive with regard of conceptual consciousness, not of direct perception. No, well, for Sautrantika, yes, but for Prasangika, no. For direct perception is deceptive also. Everything is deceptive. Every consciousness except for the direct perception of emptiness. Every other consciousness that a sentient being has. So any consciousness in the mind of an ordinary being, meaning a non-Arya being, is deceptive. And even an Arya's consciousness, experiencing conventionalities, is also deceptive. Now, for a Buddha, it's a little more complicated, but generally speaking, the Buddha's consciousness experiencing a pot in the world, that is a conventional consciousness, which in Tibetan is kunzo, meaning a concealer consciousness. So does that mean the Buddha is mistaken? Not quite. But that is part of why some people also believe that for Chandrakirti, the Buddha did not experience conventional truth. A lot of Tibetans before Tsongkhapa believed that, and some afterwards. And if you read Chandrakirti's text, there's a lot of reason to think that's what it seems to say. But Tsongkhapa thinks that's not, it's a little more subtle than that. Right? You can experience somebody else dreaming without dreaming yourself. But you have to get into that world of the dream in order to experience it. You have to be in the concealed world. So if I just see that there's a projector, if I see the lines of the projector, so I'm standing on the side and you're looking at the screen, but I just see the lines of the light coming from the projector, I know that you're looking at a projection. But I don't see what you're seeing. I don't see it from the angle that I can see the projection. Whereas if I go where you are, it doesn't look like it's being projected. It just looks like a real thing. But for the Buddha, it's possible to experience both things at the same time. It's possible to see it fully as a complete projection, and at the same time, see it the way that you see it. So that in that sense, it's not mistaken, but at the same time, it's not establishing ultimate reality from that perspective. Now, because of appearances of true existence, right, only nyamshak on emptiness is not deceptive. Yes, so the reason that any other consciousness except for the absorption in emptiness, direct absorption, direct perception of emptiness is deceptive is because there's the appearance of true existence. So as I said, for Bhavaviveka, there isn't. For a sense consciousness, when your eyes see things, there is not an experience, an appearance of true existence. If there was, then it would be deceived, and thereby it wouldn't be able to establish things. But for Chandrakirti, there is. Everything appears wrongly. When we think, when we see, whatever it is all polluted by this experience of true existence or inherent existence, which for Chandrakirti is the same thing. Okay, so I think we're getting toward the end, although if anybody else has questions, you can just let me know quickly, but otherwise I'll assume that there are not. But furthermore, people are also always welcome to write questions later that I can respond to. Yeah, there's speaking into the microphone, but I can't hear, so for whatever reason. But if anybody has questions, they can write in the chat. Otherwise, let's just say that's good for now. So yeah, as I said, this was, I believe, the hardest topic in Madhyamaka. Certainly debating it was a nightmare. But at the same time, it was very worthwhile. I really made a lot of effort with that. I remember later in the year, after we debated this, then we had to go and answer public debates. Our class had to do that, and my Kirpon, meaning the head of my class, he asked me what subject should we select. So I told them, let's do commonly appearing subjects. So we put ourselves in the line of fire, but it certainly helps to learn the subject well as best as we could, at least to answer it well. So if you can really make the effort and get used to not saying the wrong thing, because that's what will happen if you're trying to understand it. It takes a lot of work, but it does seem to help to understand the rest of the Madhyamaka topics, and then to be able to read the essence of eloquence, as I said, and see what Tsongkhapa was really saying there. Without the basic points, it's very easy to get lost. So next time, I think we'll move on to another topic, which maybe isn't quite as difficult, but is difficult in its own way. Last time we had object of negation, which, as I said, maybe the talk was a bit complicated, but ironically, I would say that's an easier subject. It's a little bit easier to access what they're talking about. Next time, we're going to talk about disintegratedness as a functioning thing, which is also extremely difficult. But I think, again, we'll do a similar thing where I'll just try to give a presentation of the basic points and what is really being talked about. I would have to say that I feel, not that I really understand either, I feel that my understanding of the commonly appearing subjects is a little better than my understanding of the disintegratedness question. But at the same time, I did put a lot of work into that, and I wrote a whole essay in Tibetan on that, which was a way to practice trying to get the points together. So I can pretty much just translate that into English and put it here for you, and we can try to discuss it. And I'm very interested to hear people's questions, because that might open up some new avenues of understanding. So just again, why is that important? Disintegratedness is a functioning thing. The real question is, how does karma work? That's what the whole debate is about. So it's very relevant to understanding Buddhist philosophy. And it's based on emptiness, but it's ultimately about karma. It's saying the only real way to understand karma is to understand emptiness. If you don't understand emptiness, you will not understand how karma works. So that's just a bit of a preview. Now it says, how did this position make the Prasangika view clearer? Essentially that it shows what does it mean that something can be conventionally established by valid cognition, yet still be not inherently existent. Right? So other schools seem to go to the extreme. They either say they're inherently existent, or like Jayananda, they say, well, if they were inherently existent, they'd have to be, if they were established by valid cognition, they'd have to be inherently existent, so therefore they're not established by valid cognition. So they go to the other extreme. Whereas here we get to the middle way here between it's established by valid cognition, yet at the same time, it's not inherently existent. So to really understand what Chandakirti is saying here would be to understand that point. And that is the Prasangika view of emptiness. It's also to understand that a mind can be, which is a related point, it can be mistaken to its object, yet still establish the object conventionally. And perhaps as a somewhat less essential point, but useful also when we talk about prasangika, or consequence, is to understand what does it mean that you don't have to use a syllogism to make an argument. You can convince somebody just with a consequence, which is what Buddhapalita was doing. So that was the first point before the commonly appearing subject, this question of reverse consequence. Okay, so thank you all. I'll say good night, and it's at least good night where I am. I don't know about where all of you are. Wherever you are, good day, good night, good morning. And yeah, I hope this is helpful, and I hope to see you again in the future. Okay.
Thank you very much, Venerable Gachev, for this incredible session. And for those interested in further studies, the FPMT Master Program at Lama Tsongkhapa Institute offers a full-time opportunity to study Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism, integrating academic study, practice, and service. To learn more about the Master Program, you can scan this QR code. And the recording of today's session will be uploaded on the website. I've set the link in the chat. And to stay informed about upcoming events, please sign up to our newsletter. Which is also on the chat. So thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to welcome you to our next event.